Okay. All right. Hello, welcome. My name is Kelly, and I'm working with Vancy and Ruby. We are students in the content-based instruction course, and we're here to talk a little bit about linguistic patterns in content areas. And here's our agenda of our presentation. We're going to have a brief introduction. We're going to talk about history, math, and science, the challenges in those content areas for language learners, as well as some supports you can offer. And finally, we'll wrap up with a big takeaway. So content-based instruction has the potential to help ELs develop academic language if teachers strategically direct the students' attention to the choices made in content-specific texts for meaning making instead of only focusing on vocabulary teaching. Because understanding content-specific text takes more than knowing the vocabulary, and the awareness of the language will assist the students to better access grade-level content knowledge.
Hello, everyone. This is Ruby. I'm going to talk about the linguistic challenges and possible linguistic support that we can provide to students when they encounter challenges or difficulties when they're learning history as a content. So history is a subject that depends a lot on the text because it's not like science or math that you can have hands-on experiences. A lot of time, the challenges and difficulties come from reading difficulties. So here, Schlepper Girl, 2007, she divided the challenges into 4 areas, which are identify events, identify participants, identify the text order, and identify the relationships between events and participants. And in the following slides, I'm going to provide the language support that we can assist the students in each of these difficulties. All right, so now let's move on to the first one, which is the identifying the events. So in history texts, there are usually a lot of events that the students need to learn about, right? So instead of just teaching the students that this is what happened, there are actually some things that some linguistic features that hint that this is the event and what happened here. For example, there are action verbs, saying, feeling, and thinking verbs such as said, expressed, or sometimes we need to help the students to distinguish academic and daily usages of words. For example, in the article, she talks about upset as sad in daily life and upset as metaphorically in history text. Next one is that the students need to identify the participants in the text, right? So it's not as simple as we think, because sometimes these participants can be concrete or abstract terms. Sometimes it's noun phrases that are more complicated for the students to decode. Sometimes they are the nominalizations, such as the conflict, which is referring to the action that was done in the previous sentence, right? And sometimes the be non-human participants or institutions. So in this case, the participants can really be who and what. So we need to teach the students to distinguish between these clauses. Next, when they successfully identify the participants and the events, they need to figure out the relationships between them, right? So they need to be able to analyze clauses. They need to know who is acting to whom and whom is being acted on, right? So the event is done by what participants, and these participants has done what. The students need to be able to analyze these clauses and figure out the relationships between events and participants. Lastly, we need to help the students to figure out the organizations of the text, right? Because sometimes sometimes content teachers might use the graphic organizers to help the students to figure out the cause and effects of an event. But we need to know that not all the historical texts are organized in that way, right? Sometimes it's an argument, sometimes it's an opinion. And in that case, we need to help the student to understand the verbs. What's the verb? What are the verbs doing? Is it stating casuality or temporal relations of events, right? We also need to help the student to identify the conjunctions and the connections. Sometimes they're marking time, causes, conditions, or other relationships. So the key here is that we can't treat every text as the same. We need to understand that historical texts have different organizations. All right. And sometimes we can utilize the deconstruct and reconstruct protocol, like help the student to deconstruct the text and put them back together to understand the relationships between each sentences and each event and each participant.
Great. Okay, hi, I'm Vancy. I'm going to talk about math. So as with all school learning, a key challenge in mathematics teaching is to help students move from everyday informal ways of constructing knowledge into the technical and academic ways that are necessary for disciplinary learning in all subjects. Each subject area has its own way of using language to construct the knowledge, and students need to be able to use language effectively to participate in those ways of knowing. So thus, in other words, the language and learning cannot be separated. And Holliday in 1978 discussed the challenges of mathematics education as mathematical registers. Here are the features of mathematic registers. So multiple semiotic system, as in doing mathematics, it is not enough to be able to work with the language alone. Mathematics draw on multiple semiotic system to construct knowledge. For example, like symbols, oral language, and written language, and visual representations such as graph and diagrams. And here is the grammatical patterns. So mathematics have its own unique grammar patterns as well. The grammatical pattern brings together long, dense noun phrases in clauses and sentences constructed with being and having verbs that present a variety of meaning relationships. In addition, mathematics problems often use conjunctions that have meanings different from their everyday uses or including implicit logical relationships that are not spelled out. So the student needs to learn the language patterns and how they construct concepts in mathematics. Here's an example, like math can be viewed as a language, a simpler, more consistent, and more regular language than English. For example, 2 times 5 is 10, which is produced an accurate sentence. So 2 5 times equal to 10 is not correct, and also other incorrect forms. So here are some strategies in math teaching. The first one, give visual clues and manipulatives. So visual resources can help students to work through complicated problems, understand foundational vocabulary, and organize their thoughts. For example, use graphic organizers such as like Venn diagrams to build visual associations. Manipulatives are used to master the abstract concept. So the teacher could encourage a student to do a poster or like draw a graph and do an experiment. Okay, so the second is teach vocabulary while teaching the lesson. Students may be lack of familiarity with vocabulary, so this would impact their performance on assessment. So we teach vocabulary while teaching the lessons. And the third one is design questions and prompts for different proficiency levels. For example, the beginners, maybe we can use more physical response and for them to answer the question. Like, for example, could you please touch the larger number? And for intermediate student, we can craft a question like use what do you do first, then what do you do, and finally, instead of how do you solve the question. Last but not least, we could use cooperative learning strategy, and students benefit from working groups where participants have varied skill levels in mathematics. Students also benefit from working groups where participants have different levels of English language competence. Usually a study group brings effective gains.
Hi, it's Kelly. I'm here to talk about the science challenges and supports. So some challenges in science are what Fang calls language of school science, which are just different linguistic features that commonly occur in school science curriculum that aren't necessarily on level with this language students are using every day in and outside the classroom. So here are some examples. They include technical vocabulary, ordinary words with non-vernacular meanings, ellipsis, lengthy noun phrases, and complex sentences. These features can cause comprehension difficulty for students, especially our ELs. So here's some supports to offer. Vocabulary building, noun expansion, sentence completion, paraphrasing, sentence stripping, and developing awareness of signposts. So I don't have time to talk about all of these, but you can go to Fang 2006 article and look for examples. Here's an example of what noun expansion is. So it's starting with a noun and adding more information to that noun so that it makes a longer noun phrase that students might see in those readings. And developing awareness of signposts is in science, they use a lot of connective words to express their ideas, and which isn't necessarily on level with the common conjunctions that ELs know. So like using words, transitional words like therefore or if and when. So just pointing those out to students and making them aware. And there's different vocabulary building, and I think sentence completion, paraphrasing, and sentence stripping is pretty self-explanatory. In speaking and listening, you can do some partner and small group work and whole class discussions. There's different activities you can do with each, but for any activity that requires students to speak and share out, you can provide them with sentence frames and guided questions to aid in their language production. So for example, if you had a guided question for students to think about, like, what do you think will happen if, you can use a sentence frame starter for those ELs, like I think blank because, and this will give them some help to actually form a sentence on their own. And they can use that key content vocabulary that was taught. In writing, an idea mentioned by Foss is having science notebooks so students have the opportunities to engage in different forms of writing and using the recursive cycle. Again, a support you can offer is adding sentence frames for these students for language production and writing. So for example, if you're looking for descriptive writing and you want to use these narratives, here are some language forms and structures that you can offer to ELs in their writing. All right. And lastly, we're going to mention our big takeaway.
So the big takeaway of this presentation is that as content teachers, your role as a teacher includes recognizing potential challenging language for your ELs, not only the content specific vocabularies, also the whole text and the logic behind the thinkings is also important. So we need to provide support for your students who might have difficulty. Here is a list of the references that we used in this presentation. If you're interested in looking up for more linguistic support that you could implement into your classroom, you can go to these articles. They have plenty of explanations. And that's all for our presentation. Thank you for listening.